If the Lord be for us, who can be against us? We pick up with modern Reformation, what has become of American fundamentalism by Dr. George Marsden. The Donald Trump era of fusing evangelical religion, politics, and cultural prejudices in many white evangelical communities has most notoriously led to the yoking of the religion to a leader whose lifestyle, character, and integrity was about as far from the old fundamentalist ideals as imaginable. But political militancy has often come to overshadow militancy in promoting true doctrine and personal purity. For many, it seems to have led to an unquestioned loyalty. Granted, Trump promised to advance some genuine Christian concerns, yet much of his popularity among white evangelicals seems to have been fueled by his appeals to individualism and suspicion of big government, racial and cultural prejudices, and long-standing cultural resentments in the communities where white evangelicals flourish. Fealty to Trump seemed to blind many to everything else. Trump, who did not hide his preoccupation with his own success and popularity, frequently declared things true or false on the basis of whether or not they benefited him, regardless of the facts involved. So Christians who had come to reverence his word had put aside their usual commitment about bearing false witness. For example, after Trump lost the 2020 election, white evangelicals were among those most likely to believe his claim that he had won in a landslide, even though there was no court-worthy evidence to support the claim. Radio host Eric Metaxas went so far as to say of overturning the election results, "I'd be happy to die in this fight. This is a fight for everything. God is with us. Jesus is with us in this fight for liberty." Others made similar claims. Some militant Christians were even among those who stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2020, to try to disrupt Congress in its certification of the presidential election. Whether or not such political militancy can be seen as a new variant of fundamentalism, it has had the effect of drastically changing the public image of American evangelicalism. The term evangelical has come to take on, for many outsiders, almost as negative set of connotations as has the term fundamentalist. These tendencies are likely one reason this movement has been losing young people in recent years. Many thoughtful observers from within the evangelical tradition have been wondering whether they can still use that term. Fundamentalism, like revivalist evangelicalism before it, has always had numerically dominant populist side. Early Reformed leaders such as J. Gresham Machen worried about such tendencies, but reluctantly accepted the fundamentalist labor in a larger effort to counter theological liberalism. And at mid-century, the new evangelicalism, designed by Harold J. Ockenga, a former student of Machen, had as one of its principal goals the tempering of fundamentalistic populism with carefully developed theological principles drawn from sound scholarship and the deeper Christian theological heritage. He finally returned to theology. We turn now to the article by Dr. Brianis on honoring the brotherhood. Freed to love the brotherhood, but how? Love one another before a watching world. In the current politically polarized climate, we have allowed masks and vaccinations to breed hostility, even church splits, rather than promote love. Cultural emphases have slowly and subtly crept into our churches, corrupting the way we treat one another, welcome one another. Romans 15:7 becomes exclude one another. Tolerate one another in love. Ephesians 4:2 becomes discredit one another in apathy. Outdo one another in showing love. Romans 12:10 becomes outdo one another in gaining favor. In humility, count one another more significant than yourselves. Philippians 2:3 becomes in pride, count one another more insignificant than yourself. This seems to be a bit of an overstatement from an armchair theologian. Our lives should exhibit the way of the cross, not the way of the world. Our delightful duty is to display Christ in our lives, not on the hallmarks of our culture. For when we love one another as Christ loved us, then all people will know that we are Christian disciples. But when we hate one another, the world won't be able to distinguish us from unbelievers. Love one another against a hostile world. As much as we need to display our love before the world, we also need to love against it. Love builds up the church, Ephesians 4:16. But God, who is love, 1 John 4:16, remains the source of our love. Jesus Christ, the epitome of love, reigns far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and is the head of the church, Ephesians 1:20-23. We draw from his inexhaustible resources to love our brothers and sisters amid hostility. The government will increasingly become more volatile and hostile towards churches and Christian institutions. The state continues to indoctrinate our children with unabashedly liberal agenda. Unbelieving employers are irrepressibly imposing mandates contrary to one's Christian conscience. But none of this should surprise us. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. 1 John 3:13. Why? Because we are not of the world, but belong to the one whom the world hated first. May our love be the first thing that defines us, whether in word or deed, as it shines before or against the world, diametrically opposed to the gospel of Christ. This is by David E. Briones, PhD from Durham, Associate Professor of New Testament, author of Paul's Financial Policy, a socio-theological approach, and is in the process of writing a commentary on Philemon. We will pick this up, God willing, later. Now we turn to Dr. Cobley's article in the Westminster Theological Journal entitled "In Puritan New England as the New Israel." And he's commenting on a book and thesis of Sakvan Berkovich, who has made much of this claim that the New England Puritans claimed. to be the new Israelites. An even more important critic was Roger Williams, the principal founder of Rhode Island, and his expulsion from Massachusetts Bay in 1636. Berkovich's first major article on typology, published in 1967, was about Williams' running dispute with John Cotton. Berkovich saw Cotton as a spokesman for American Puritans who had arrogated that identity as a figurative Israel to themselves, and Williams is an outsider who tried in vain to argue the orthodoxy out of this strange, unique folly. For Berkovich, the most revealing change came in 1644, when Williams asked Cotton if he thought that England was the antitype of Babylon and New England the antitype of the Promised Land. Doth you count the very land of England literally Babylon, and the land of New England, Judea and Canaan? Berkovich called this query perhaps the best summary of the difference between the two men. These then were the main points which Berkovich made to support his argument that the New England Puritans saw themselves as the antitypical chosen people. But despite the textual evidence which seems to corroborate it, this argument is deeply flawed. The case against Berkovich. To begin with, contemporaries living elsewhere in the Anglo-American world sounded like American Puritans, except for the differences in geographical locations. Anglicans compared the English migration to Virginia to the Exodus and likened the Indians to the Canaanites. Samuel Purchas, for example, observed that just as the Israelites entered upon the houses, cities, and possessions of the cursed Canaanites, so Christians entered into Virginia. And Christian Brooke, a member of the Virginia Company, construed backsliding planters as Israelites who had idolatrized and wantonized under Canaanite influence in the Promised Land. I knew that other denominations claimed that. Now we turn to Mr. Walther's argument in the Mid-America Journal, Verbal Plenary Inspiration and Bible Translation Methods. I'm looking forward to this article coming to an end. Basically, he's arguing against literal translation. And he's wrought up and overworking himself. Following the Wycliffe versions, but unrelated to them, William Tyndale produced the first translation of the New Testament into modern English. This was also the first time the New Testament was translated from Greek into English. After Tyndale, English translations basically built upon his work, initially filling in Old Testament portions left untranslated by Tyndale by translating from Latin and German. Coverdale 1535, Matthews 1537, Great Bible 1539. Actually, Coverdale was Matthews, which became the Great Bible. Not officially a revision of the Tyndale edition, but still very much within that tradition. The Geneva Bible 1560 provided the first complete English Old Testament translated from Hebrew. This following two revisions of the Tyndale translation, the Bishop's Bible 1568 and the King James 1611, benefited from the advances of the German Bible, the Geneva Bible, in various extents. Thus, from the beginning, the English Bible translation into modern English, Tyndale, to the King James versions, all widely used translations, were closely related, most being direct revisions of what had gone before. Then, from the production of the King James until the 20th century, the King James remained basically uncontested in widespread usage. The King James versions was arguably the most significant updating of the Tyndale translation. Yet even the translators of the King James Version were, officially though not in practice, bound to the text of the Tyndale tradition. The first of Bishop Bancroft's rules for the translators of the King James was that the text of the bishop's Bible was to be followed and little altered as the truth of the original will permit. One implication of this brief historical sketch is that the uniformity of translations was mostly widely used from the 16th to the 20th centuries as a result of the fact that there was in substance one main translation with varying degrees of modification. This uniformity was not the result of the conscious determination of the translator or team of translators. I'm not sure why we got all that, but second, we must not construe the history of English Bible translation as representative of the tendencies of almost all translations until the mid-20th century. Ryken does not necessarily intend to do this, as his focus is on only the history of English Bible translation, in which functional equivalence principles gained ground in the mid-20th century, marking a shift away from the Tyndale King James Version. However, centuries of Bible translation history precedes the first translations into English, and a truly accurate assessment of the novelty of functional equivalence principles must take stock of this wider sweep of translation history. We're very unhappy with that article. Now turn to Anglican and Episcopal history and Thomas Cole in the Episcopal Church. Thomas Cole was a convert and joined the Episcopal Church and became a famous painter of landscapes. And then later, toward the end of his life, he was painting paintings that showed the life of an individual from birth to childhood to adult years to old age. At each of these four stages of life, and thus in each of the four paintings, there are three cycles present. The biographical or cycle of life, reflected in the developing age and appearance of the person who's the subject of all four paintings: childhood, youth, manhood, old age. 2, the seasonal or cycle of the seasons of the year, reflected in the color of the plants and flowers of each four seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. And 3, the diurnal or cycle of passage of the day, reflected in the degree and intensity of sunlight and shadow in each painting: daybreak, high noon, evening, and night. Readers are now invited to look more closely at the two series of four paintings. The first series, done 1839 to 40, now in Utica. The second series, 1841 to 42, now in the National Gallery in Washington, and to reflect upon the four stages of life's voyage and the three cycles present at each stage. In view of the descriptions that Cole himself prepared for the opening exhibition of the first series in Utica, 1840. The direction of the Voyager is reversed in the second and fourth painting. And we will skip, we've got pages of painting here. We'll look at that privately as he is reviewing God's providence in the life of a man, and providence they believed in the Anglican tradition very strongly. And now for the churchmen, Dr. Donald West, it has an article, How Jesus' Cry from the Cross in Mark 15:34 is answered. Just briefly here, just a few notes. Jesus' cry in verse 34. Jesus' cry in the words of Psalm 22:1 forms the climax of Mark's passion narrative. As is well known, Psalm 22 is composed of both a lament, verses 1 to 21, and a thanksgiving song, verses 22 to 31. In response to God's hearing the psalmist's cry. Strikingly, all the allusions in the Markan narrative from the lament portion of Psalm 22 and are presented in almost exact reverse order of their occurrence in the psalm. Reader's attention is clearly being directed to the agonizing cry of the psalm's first verse. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And we will bring that little brief clip to an end as we turn to the Protestant Reformed Theological Journal. Committing the truth to faithful men, the centennial history of the Protestant Reformed Theological Seminary, which began in 1925, almost up to the 100-year anniversary in 3 years. The contracted curatorium, that was the oversight board, met several times and reported its work to the curatorium as a whole. In May 1932, it reported to the curatorium that it had not needed to meet during the previous months. In January 1934, that it had examined John Hooksberger with a view to admitting him to school. And in January 1936, that it did the same to Mr. Peter Weiss. Beginning in January 1936, the curatorium decided that the report of the contracted curatorium should always appear in full in the minutes of the curatorium. The existence and work of the curatorium underscores that the theological school of the Protestant Reformed churches is not a private endeavor of a few men, nor do the professors have the final say, as ought to be the case with every ecclesiastical endeavor. The work is supervised because it is the denomination's work. It is fitting, then, that the work be done in accord with prearranged regulations. To this end, 2 constitutions were drawn up almost immediately, one for the faculty and another for the curatorium. These documents were revised over time, but still today, both the Theological School Committee and the faculty have their own constitutions to regulate their work. The beginnings were humble, and the fruit was small from an earthly perspective. Only 8 of the 42 students labored in the PRCA ministry until their death, but the Lord prospered it, and he would continue to lead and direct in the years ahead. We bring that article to an end. It looks like our next article will be Calvin's only letter to Luther, January 20, 1545, for our next occasion. And now we are in the Reformed Theological Journal, an article by Dr. Scott Swain on the Psalms and the Christian life. It's a very well done article. He has a facile command of the Psalter. So refreshing to find men like this. Following God's instruction in this vale of tears, we find many occasions to lament, and the Psalms prepare us for all these occasions. The Psalms teach us to lament the wicked, who devotes all his energies to our downfall and destruction. Psalm 36. The Psalms teach us to lament the betrayal of friends. Psalm 55, 69, and 109. The Psalms teach us to lament the mismatch between God's promises and present realities. Psalm 89. And the Psalms teach us to lament our sin, our inbred capacity. Psalm 51:5. To stray from God's path like lost sheep. Psalm 119, 176. A capacity which eludes our power to grasp or to master. But the Psalms also teach miserable sinners like us to call upon the name of the Lord. Quote, send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy. And I will praise you with the lyre, O my God. God's law in the Psalter is not only a path that he reveals, that he reveals and that he calls us to travel. It is also a path on which he sends us aid by sending us himself. God will send out his steadfast love and faithfulness. Psalm 57:3. A path on which he accompanies us. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Psalm 23:4. A path on which he leads us as our front and rear guard to our final and blessed destination. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Psalm 23:6. Because of the Lord's presence to help, accompany, and guide us, the valley of tears becomes a place of springs. Psalm 84:6. God's anointed king. The Psalms claim that the Christian life is a good life. They seek to make us whole and happy persons, holy and happy in God, by directing us to the end of the good life, the beatitudinal life, which is to dwell in God's house, and by directing us to the path of that good life, which lies in following God's instruction. Our survey of the Psalms' teaching on the good life would not be complete, however, without considering the personal, messianic dimension of its moral instruction. The Psalms seek to make us whole and happy persons, holy and happy in God, by knitting our hearts to God's anointed King, who is both the end of the good life and the path of that which is to come. We'll bring this to a close. Psalms and the Christian Life by Dr. Scott Swain. As we shift to the Southwestern Theological Journal, an article by Dr. Patrick Schreiner, The Old Testament in Acts, a macro perspective. He's talked about the book of Acts 1 through 7 in Jerusalem, and then 8 through 11 or so on widening out the mission, and then the last part of the structure is 12 to the end, the gospel going to the world. We pick up in Antioch, the third largest city of the empire. In Antioch, the disciples are first called Christians in the book of Acts. The term Christian parallels Latin political terms and further signals a shift in focus away from Judea to the larger Roman world. In fact, Christian is a Greek word of Latin form with Semitic background, thus encapsulating the cosmopolitan context of early Christianity. A new name is coined for a new identity and mission. The origin of the most popular English term for Jesus' followers was based on a multi-ethnic reality. In Acts 13:1, Luke identifies the leaders of this diverse community in Antioch. Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucian of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. The extra descriptors are important. Barnabas, a Hellenized Jew, and Saul, a Pharisee, bookend the list and will receive the attention as we move forward. Three other individuals are named, indicating the assorted nature of the assembly. Simeon is also called Niger, which is Latin for black, and likely indicates a southern origin. Lucian is of Cyrene, which is in North Africa. Manaen is described as being reared with Herod the Tetrarch. This is the same Herod Antipas in Luke 3:1 and Acts 4:27 who conspired against Jesus. Manaen was therefore likely of high society, a child companion of the king. Luke's list is therefore quite instructive. Saul is from Tarsus, but trained as a Pharisee. Barnabas, a native of Cyprus, was a Jew of the diaspora with a priestly background. There are two black men from the south and a man who had considerable social standing. The leaders in Antioch contained a Pharisaical Jew, two men from Africa, a Hellenized Jew, and a privileged person. No wonder in Antioch that they got the name Christian. We will bring that to a close as we move to the Protestant Reformed Journal. An article, a book review by James Waddell Alexander. His review of Paul Henry's The Life of John Calvin, the Great Reformer. Talking about Calvin, who's just come to Geneva. His yearly stipend was 50 crowns, about 80 bushels of corn, 2 barrels of wine, and his lodging, which was thought a considerable salary. But after making every allowance for the depreciation of money, we perceive that it was a narrow living from the fact that the council found it necessary at times to lend him a helping hand. True to his principles, he threw off 10 crowns in 1546 when he was sick, and in 1553 2 more, which had been given him for his expenses to burn as a public agent. On December 28, 1556, the council sent him fuel for his room. In May 1560, they presented him with a cask of the best wine because what he had was poor. In 1563, he declined receiving 25 crowns for the expenses of his sickness, earnestly beseeching the council not to force them upon him. He even vowed that he would never enter their pulpit if they again disregarded his feelings in this manner. He further renounced 25 crowns, nearly half his living, in order to fulfill his conscientious determination to accumulate nothing. He once appeared before the council in some debate with an Anabaptist who treated him opprobriously, and after exhausting his other sources of abuse, charged the Genovese pastor with luxurious living. He then called Calvin a niggard, at which Calvin, there was general laughter, for all remember how much I had this very year declined to receive from themselves, and so seriously that I protested I would never preach there again unless they desisted. And they knew that I had not merely refused their extraordinary munificence, but had remitted a portion of my dues, not less than 20 crowns. In 1558, when his colleagues were suffering from poverty and could not even send their children to school, he went to the council and caused them to bring down his salary to the same amount as theirs. Henry observes that he can find in no manuscript notice of the sale of any unpublished work to the booksellers. Even Catholic writers have observed and mentioned this trait of rigor. Florimond de Raymond says, under a body dry and attenuated, he ever had a fresh and vigorous mind, prompt at rejoinder, bold in attack. He was, give me a second till this populates, he was a good something. Hope that, if it's going to be able to move on with. Okay, we'll just draw that to a close as we finish. A great faster, even in old age, never in mixed company, perpetually retired. Calvin is almost without parallel. So we bring Reverend Archibald's review of Henry's Life of Calvin to a close as we turn to the Concordia Theological Journal, The Confession of a Lutheran University by Dr. David Loy. Learning in a Lutheran university also means that the pursuit of knowledge is interwoven with concern and care. Although we can achieve amazing technical feats, many of the successes of the technological project of mastery make us all feel less rather than more in control of our destinies. Moreover, a purely technical education fractures community. In the Lutheran tradition, the means for developing wisdom have been both the scriptures and the liberal arts. In his treatment of the Reformation era pedagogical reforms in evangelical lands, Thomas Korkok observes that the general disciplines to be taught included religion, catechesis, Latin, literature, beginning with Aesop's fables, which Luther and other reformers praised, history, and music. Each discipline was chosen to help students develop wisdom and good character. In our contemporary context, the selection of disciplines will likely differ. However, the key is to inculcate wisdom through value-laden reflection on technical issues, and such reflection requires the liberal arts. If the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, then the liberal arts alone are not sufficient for developing wisdom in the fullness of the gospel. The gospel will also be necessary. While the purpose of the gospel is not to legislate regarding matters of God's left-hand reign in the world, the content of the Christian faith nevertheless has implications for our understanding of and relationship to the world in which we live. that the Father gave his Son to redeem sinful human beings shapes the way Christians understand authority. That Christ shed his blood for every human being informs the way Christians relate to those around. The scriptures are therefore indispensable for cultivating wisdom in the fullest sense of the word. The point is not that the liberal arts are without a clear Christian confession that it's useless. They are not. They can and do contribute to a certain level of civic righteousness. However, the Christian faith also contributes to wisdom and informs our understanding of the world. For that reason, the Lutheran University's vocation towards society requires it to maintain a substantive public confession. We shift to Princeton Theological Review. We got a young fella, Eric Tuttle, writing third-year seminary student, an article, God's Simple Knowledge in Disagreement. Disagreement, complexity, and conflict have become facts of our modern political and social world, whether because of increased technology or more sophisticated social structures. We are now more keenly aware that for every claim we make, there are people who disagree with us. Conceptual frameworks for thinking about disagreement could be generalized as falling somewhere between two extremes. On one extreme, if one side's views are absolutized as exhausting all possible truth, there's the temptation to coerce the other side into adopting that point of view. Because ideas are not inert abstractions, but are also always material and concrete. In this way of thinking, a group will try to employ whatever resources are available to them within a given power dynamic to make reality match their own point of view. Given this framework, then, if we agree, the best way for me to ensure the materiality of my own point of view is exploiting the power dynamic between us through violently repressing your views or through practices of social exclusion from a community, slandering someone's reputation, or denouncing on Twitter. On the other hand, if our views are made a function of some social discourse that holds no relation to the larger reality of truth, our actions become just as coercive and violent because they are no longer subject to reality. The best way for me to ensure the materiality of my beliefs in this framework is through ignoring all opposing ideas and asserting a sort of non-historical freedom. That is, freedom that does not account for one's place in history or the larger truth. Ever since Kant locked the divine reality away into the realm of the noumena, making all talk about God secondary to our practical judgments, the human reality has been given the purely axiomatic position in political theory. In this context, the divine reality either gets a short appendix at the end of an already worked out system or gets no mention at all. We will move on now to Themelios. Navigating Empathy is the new article by Jonathan Worthington. Abstract. What exactly is empathy? There is confusion. Most empathy scholars laud it as putting yourself in someone's mental and emotional shoes for a time, usually to help them. Most lay people also commend empathy, but some misunderstand it and are actually commending such unhealthy practices as enmeshment and extreme relativism. but under the banner of empathy. Other people condemn empathy as enticing sin, polarizing, but they tend to condemn non-empathic practices that have been called empathy by their perpetrators without realizing the term is being used wrongly. They thereby seem to critique, and many times think they are critiquing, empathy itself. Can multiple definitions of empathy conflict and yet be legitimate? If conflicting definitions of one term are used widely, how can they be legitimate? If conflicting definitions this article helps readers navigate discussions about what empathy is and is not within academic research, diverse lay uses of the term, and various clashes that arise. Jesus saw people hurt and was moved deep in his gut. He had pity, even compassion. Several verses. Experienced what medical and psychological scholars sometimes call sympathy and emotional discomfort or even pain caused by the realization that something bad has happened to another person. Jesus also took what psychological and medical scholars call an empathic stance. Jesus still understands our human nature, weakness, suffering, temptation from our vantage point, even feeling something of the emotions we feel in all types of situations. And it is Christ's empathic approach to us that motivates us to approach the throne of grace with the confidence in helping mankind. The article Navigating Empathy aims to help several groups of readers. Some do not know what empathy is. Some are familiar enough to already have queries about my word choices. More on that below, and we'll pick this up later. God be for us, who can be against us? Till next time.